Well, wonderful, Melissa. So to start our conversation, I'd hope you share a bit about yourself and share how you've been a member of the Hopkins community.
Okay, well, I am a recent alumna. I don't know if I can call myself recent since it's been almost over a year now, but I graduated Hopkins back in 2020, the year that everyone was collectively acknowledging
Yes.
probably didn't need to happen. But anyway, 2020 was when I graduated. I graduated with my bachelor's in neuroscience, and I identify as a FLI, both being first generation in my family to have a bachelor's degree, as well as coming from a limited income background throughout my time at Hopkins. And I did a lot of things. I was really active in Greek life for a really long time. I participated in research when I could, and also worked really intensely with the Center for Student Success in different capacities. So as an intern working there, as well as with the FLI initiative. So the CSS is like family.
Awesome. Well, great. Thank you for that, Melissa. And I wonder, you mentioned, being home and certainly being a first generation student. Could you just share sort of where is home, or what places might you consider home that isn't Hopkins?
Yeah, of course. So home is a couple different places for me, being both a first generation student, but also a first generation immigrant. So I was actually born in Haiti and was raised there up until I was 5 years old, and moved to Miami back in 2003 to be with my father. So my sister, my mother, and I moved to have our family be together. And I've been living in North Miami since. And leaving to go to Baltimore was actually my first time out of the state since I had first moved back. So that goes to show you how my community in the greater North Miami area, which is also a really predominantly Haitian like subsection of Miami, is just where I was raised and grew up. And then I did a lot of growing up in Baltimore too. So I think when I reference Baltimore, I call it home as well. So I think now I'm collecting homes like Infinity Stone. So Miami is definitely home for all intents and purposes. Haiti is home in its own way, and I think Baltimore now is throughout the time I spent there and experiences I made, I think that's home as well.
Well, that's great. I wonder if we could talk a little bit just sort of about when you did leave home, when you left North Miami, you left that community you had known so much, and you got to Hopkins. What did you expect, right? Did your expectations come true, or were there things that surprised you?
Well, to be fair to Baltimore, I had visited for a flying program my senior year, so I had gotten a little bit about what the campus was like. And the same senior year, or maybe that same year from junior year going into senior year, I took a class trip for the first time to Washington, D.C. And that's when I kind of made up my mind and decided that I don't know how I'm going to be making it back to like the DMV area, but I have to go. I need to be here. DC is where it's at. The DMV is where I need to be. And then when I visited Hopkins that same fall, it kind of just like felt reaffirming that I was like, okay, this is like the perfect place for me. And I remember thinking, like very facetiously, I was like, oh my God, I was wearing makeup the entire trip. Like my makeup doesn't melt. This must be the place for me to be. So
The weather so
compared to North Miami, it was like the weather is so mild. I actually get to see the leaves change. So I think a lot of what like drew me to Baltimore and like kept me while I was there to kind of like mitigate the homesickness was that like it was so much different than North Miami. And that was kind of what I was looking for as a senior in high school. Like I knew North Miami and the rest of South Florida was just like not going to be it for me. Almost every school I applied to was out of state. I think I used in-state schools as kind of like my fail-safe. Is if no one else will take me, I guess I'll go here. Is kind of like my thought process behind staying in Florida. And gratefully that happened to be through Hopkins, and I got to explore Baltimore for what it was. I wish, like my biggest, I think regret, I don't want to say it as a regret, but I think one of the biggest things that I wish I did more of was explore Baltimore, the city, as opposed to be at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. So I can always come back to Baltimore and explore it in its own right now that I'm not a student anymore. But I think during those 4 years was when I feel like I could have made the community a little more community-like than just where I went to school. So, but I think overall, back to answering your question about how much it was different, I think it was different in a lot of ways that helped me grow, but a lot of the same ways that made me feel comfortable and not as homesick as I could have been. So being in a community that was predominantly Black, just like North Miami is, being Baltimore, I've really felt like I could go up anywhere, up any street and down any street, and kind of have the comfortability to be in a place where I knew that I would blend in for all intents and purposes. Things like doing my hair, it didn't come at a hassle. Like, I could come, whether it was students who were here at Hopkins or in the city, I could find places to get my hair done. So I know that's not typical for a lot of people who go away to school, typically coming from a more urban place, but I'm happy that that transplant was similar enough for me to not get too shell-shocked, but different enough for me to enjoy Baltimore in its own right.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. No, thank you for sharing. It certainly, I think it speaks a lot to your first point around sort of making Baltimore home for you.
Yeah.
Right? And sort of finding ways to sort of make that happen. And I wonder, sort of being in Baltimore, you mentioned neuroscience was your major. How did you sort of get on that pathway, right? What helped you make that decision once you were here as a student?
So that was completely by accident. It's really funny because I didn't decide, I wasn't even considering neuro as a major until I did hop in, which was the bridge program through the CSF. And I was the second cohort, and one of the classes was Introduction to Neuroscience. And we took it with, I think, one of my favorite professors during my Hopkins experience, Dr. Hendry, who's, I think, still kind of in and out of faculty at Hopkins, give or take, from the last I heard. But Dr. Hendry was the person teaching it. He was such a captivating lecturer that I was like, wow, I could get into this. Before, I was leaning more toward a psychology-oriented kind of degree, or kind of undecided, because I knew the end-all be-all was just, I was pre-med at the time, and pre-med was the biggest priority. So however I got to get there was kind of inconsequential at that point. And then I was like, okay, neuro, after looking at it, after being in that class and enjoying the challenge, but also knowing that that's something I could still have more questions about. Like, I feel like I was challenged enough, but also curious enough about the topic, that when I started looking at more of the incidental, like the course requirements and things like that, I was like, oh, it overlaps perfectly with pre-med. So even if pre-med was my priority, it falls right in this alley, give or take, plus or minus a few neuro courses. So that's how I first began to decide. And then the more neuro coursework I did, the more I realized that, wow, like there's so many different directions you can take this. And now that I'm considering graduate school, I'm even in a further direction that's a lot different than like basic neuroscience. So finding ways to kind of use the knowledge that I got through that major in ways that I feel like would be impactful in a career is something that I'm navigating right now, but I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise were it not for that program.
Awesome. No, it's great. And I hear two things I want to follow up on in that sort of space. One is, certainly I think you were introduced to neuroscience, something you hadn't sort of really thought about until you were introduced to it. And I wonder if you could think about a little bit of sort of what propelled you to want to sort of maybe take that risk, right? To say, this is interesting and I don't know a lot, but this was captivating, so maybe I'll just take another course, another 2 sets of classes. You remember what that experience was like?
Oh, it was just like naivete. Like, okay. I was naive. Yeah. I was like, oh, like brazenly, like really, really confident about the fact that I was challenged, because up until that point, like I was doing really well in all my classes. I'd already gotten part-time with a degree. I got an associate's while graduating high school. So I felt like I had been in the ringer. And then when I first got to this class, it was really hard. And I think a lot of people who were in that same cohort as me taking that class were like, this is the hardest thing that we've all ever done. And I was like, if I could make it out alive through this one, how many more could I do? And that was a mistake. Maybe approaching it with that kind of like brazen, I don't know, like the gusto that I feel like I probably approached it in hindsight was maybe a little irresponsible, but I think that's what it was. It was like, I really appreciated being challenged. I liked knowing enough about it to not feel like I was floundering, but also not knowing enough that like I could always learn something different whenever I came into a class or touched another lecture, hit a different part of neuroscience. And at the time, again, my motivation was to kind of be pre-med, and I went in knowing that Ben Carson, the doctor, was really inspiring to me. So Ben Carson, the doctor, not a politician, but that's
yes, yeah.
So like knowing that the legacy of that came from Hopkins, I knew kind of like neuroscience was kind of would be affirming for that. So like if I could do neuroscience successfully, then maybe I could be a neurosurgeon like I thought I was going to be. And nothing like that happened at all. But first kind of approaching it as like, this is going to be what affirms me as a first generation student in an elite university with this really advanced STEM degree in neuroscience. I feel like that is what's going to give me my brand. And lo and behold, I mean, it did eventually, but I don't think if I had to do it all over again, that would be my first motivation.
No, I appreciate that. No, I appreciate the candidness. And I will lean in to say, you talk about, you alluded to, right, the challenges of perhaps your naivete when you jumped into it. Of like, it was something that challenged me, and I was just leaning into the challenge. Like, this is cool, it's a new thing, and it can be affirming. And I wonder if you can think back to those memories and sort of what were maybe some highlights that you can remember along the challenges that eventually panned out for you.
Okay, I think two things stand out. Probably the first really inconsequential one was when I got my first like really good test score in a neuro class. And like that was maybe like a needle in a haystack. Like, to be really candid with you, I think I was just like scraping by before that point and scraped by every point after. But I got a really good score in this one exam, and I was like, whoa, I know enough about this to tell you when you ask. And I was just so impressed with myself for like weeks, but it was like, and I barely passed, I barely got a good, I think it was like a 90 or something, so maybe like an A-. But I was just like, wow, that was like the first time that I was like not at the mercy of the curve. I wasn't like just trying to hedge my bets kind of thing. So I felt really confident in knowing the material and being able to like parse through the material. And then I think the other point was when maybe toward my junior and senior year, when I started becoming more interested in the research topics that I'm interested in now and trying to pursue graduate training with, is when I wrote, when I applied for a really competitive school grant for undergrads, and wrote it kind of irresponsibly again, like kind of like out of rush, like kind of like the heat of the moment. I was like, what are the odds that I write this grant and I get it? And so the deadline was like, I think I was looking at it all semester, and then it just fell off my radar because the semester got really loaded. And then 5 days before it, they send you that automated, the application is due in 5 days. I'm like, okay, well, let me swing an entire grant in 5 days, where everyone's probably taking the entire like 3 months to probably prepare for this. And I was like, okay, what are the odds? And I had been struggling to kind of find research in a specific topic that I really wanted to be trained under, and it was just like, at this point I would have to start taking anything. And this presented like a really unique opportunity for me to both kick off that research credit but also do it in something that I wanted to do. So I was like, okay, why not? So I applied, really got a recommendation last minute for somebody who was really forgiving. And I applied and I got it, but I spent all of my senior year creating a research project from scratch under the direction of somebody that one of my mentors now, who I really admire. And incidentally was right in the middle of the pandemic, so it never got off the ground in terms of recruiting and finding people or anything, but I was able to kind of go from start to finish and create something that, like, ideate something from just a thought to materializing it as a project. And I think that's probably one of the most affirming parts of undergrad, like realizing that I could do something like this, and now there are professionals who do this as a living, and I was being able to do this like at the ground front eyes through this opportunity. So I think that's...
No, thank you so much. Yeah, I love that experience of sort of, and it's a sort of, so you take a risk, you find the affirming identity, you develop the skills, and then you can have this ambition piece. And now, right, as you prepare for graduate study and you're in your post-undergrad experience, I wonder, if you can think about the path along the way to get here, right, and the journey you've sort of navigated, and perhaps maybe offer to some students why it was okay that you may have chosen not to go the pure MD route, and how you sort of probably navigated that experience. I imagine as a student with Haitian parents, right, trying to tell their parents that I'm not going to do this doctor thing in the traditional sense was probably a tough thing to navigate.
I think the hardest part was admitting it to myself. And then, because I feel like I could have told my parents anything. Like, I gave you the Johns Hopkins. Like, that's yours. You can keep that and brag to your friends and brag to the family. The degree's gonna come, So I was just like, is this something that I want to do? Or is this something that I've told myself that I wanted to do for so long that now I can't see myself outside of this really ironclad identity almost that I created for myself without giving myself the freedom to explore the what if or the what else, you know? So I think it was harder to make sure that that's what I wanted to do in terms of dropping out of pre-med, because I went back and forth with the decision for a really long time. It wasn't until I think confidently the fall of my senior year where I was just like, yeah, I'm not gonna do this, and it's not worth the last minute pulling together, because I just hadn't prioritized it for this long, or I've been indecisive about it. And it's like a decision that requires 15 years of commitment needs to be done with more with more I don't know, like a level head, not as the pressure of everyone else taking the MCAT at the same time, or everyone else applying to medical school right now, the cycle when you haven't even decided whether or not you want to do it. So I had to get over a lot of that kind of, I don't know if it's reverse imposter syndrome. It was just like, I didn't feel like I was the person who I told myself and told everyone else I was. But I also just like, it was really affirming to kind of let go of that like pressure that I put on myself, and I'm good for that. It's like being able to like put this pressure on myself to succeed, but also being able to define success in other ways. So for me, what it boiled down to is there are so many other things that I feel like I am interested in that also revolve around being able to prioritize people's wellness, prioritize people's care, that there are ways to do it. And then my mom, like a lot of my parents' favorite saying is that all roads lead to Rome. So there are different paths to get to the same end goal, whether that end goal is a professional degree, whether that end goal is being able to be a care provider, whatever it was. I wanted to kind of give myself the freedom to do that. And it wasn't realistically until maybe still during this like post-grad period where I'm considering something as off the grid as anthropology to incorporate into my understanding of neuroscience, that I was just like, wow, I would not have put that on my bingo card at 15. So like I would not have called that for myself for a long time. And I think being able to confidently say that and not say that kind of like as a doubting moment was really powerful for me. And that was, I think, the biggest hurdle for me to kind of overcome.
And I want to lean in. So you mentioned two things. Earlier, you mentioned certainly being a first generation student. And just now you sort of mentioned imposter phenomenon, sort of this idea that it was sort of creeping. And so inquiring minds are curious. Do you still think about your FLI identity, or do you still experience imposter phenomenon even after you've graduated?
God, all the time. And I was actually just talking to a colleague about when will this go away? Like, how much of a professional will I actually need to be before I'm just like confidently standing in that identity of being a professional? So I think I still experience it, but not in the ways that I feel like I experienced it at Hopkins, because at Hopkins, I felt like I was a small fish with other small fish in an ocean. So like, it wasn't like small fish, big pond kind of situation. It was just like vastness, and everyone knew, so many people know so many things. And it's like how much of what I know felt valuable in this space. And now I'm back kind of not in the opposite of it, but like I'm working as a professional, but not necessarily understanding what the professional world is supposed to be like. So in terms of work-life balance, or kind of being able to prioritize wellness in a work day or in a work week, and what that looks like as someone who is ambitious and wants to show and like prove their worth to the stakeholder, but also wants to be able to be a person outside of work. So I think it's less imposter syndrome and more experiencing balance as an adult. So, and then it's like, are other people feeling this way? And why are they not feeling this way? So if you are not feeling this way, what am I doing wrong? And that's kind of what I think like the tinge of imposter is like, how are you doing it better than, how are you adulting better than me? And what am I missing? How do I get there? So I think in that way, it kind of rears its ugly head, but I've a lot of also what I feel like I gained from my experience at Hopkins is how to fake it till you make it. It's how to kind of navigate knowing as little as you do until you know more, and then kind of working with that knowledge that you continue to acquire as you acquire it, because there are people who have spoken to me and told me that even at their age, or that's their stature in this professional career, that they still find themselves not knowing what they're doing or not knowing what's going on. So being able to confidently be okay with not knowing is something that I took away from the experience of feeling like an imposter at Hopkins.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I appreciate you sharing that. It's, to me, I always think about, when I graduated college as a FLI student and got into the professional world, it became this sort of thing of like, oh no, I know how to be a professional, but I don't. And I thought that, like, right, if you work hard and you ask questions and you showed up each day, people would recognize how hard you work and opportunities would come. And then you realize, no, that's not really the game, right? The rules are different here. It's not quite the same. And how do I learn these rules so fast?
And no one tells you the rules. There's no
right.
rule when you get your first day. It's a lot of spoken rules, and you just have to flounder and make mistakes until you don't.
Yeah, absolutely. In that same sort of vein, I wonder, can you talk a bit about sort of financially? So how did you financially prepare and plan yourself for graduation?
Oh, I didn't. Oh, I absolutely did not. To be honest with you, my last maybe 8 months of my senior year were, I can't curse, but it was a mess. And I was navigating not knowing what I was doing. My dad had gotten really sick at the time and eventually passed away 3 days before my last spring semester started. And I was just kind of dealing with, let me make it to the next day and the next day and the next day until I figure out graduation. Eventually there was at one point where I figured I was like, okay, maybe not even graduating because of everything that was going on and how I just kind of got sopped up into a whirlwind that I was not even thinking about post-grad. To be honest with you, I didn't even fill in a job application until maybe 5 weeks before school ended. So it was a lot of the groundwork that I was just like, I'm just gonna go home and then figure it out.
Yeah.
And we're also, I think, to give myself a little more grace, and we were kind of first navigating the beginnings of the pandemic. No one knew what was going on. So I was kind of in the company of a lot of people who were unsure, but not unsure for the same reasons that I was unsure. Maybe they had plans that eventually fell through because they were looking back since September and October, secured a job, and now because of the pandemic, funding is kind of out of the way and they had to be furloughed or something like that. But I was at point below zero. So I was just not even considering what the next 6 months looked like. So my original plan was just get home and apply to as many research places as possible and figure it out, do whatever I need to do in the meantime to be able to support looking for a job until I was on my feet. So for the first, it was fortunately enough that I, through the work that I was doing with my mentor for my research project, I told him that I would either really like to come back to work for him, or if he had leads anywhere that he could send me to, that's how it worked. So it was really through word of mouth that I first got a couple interviews for research associate positions. And fortunately enough, a lot of them were in Miami still. So I interviewed with a couple of scientists and then got my first job, thankfully not too long after I had eventually had to graduate. So I graduated in summer term and got my first job in September. So stroke of luck. But I would not recommend preparing like I prepared. It was a mess. Everyone was like, so what are you doing? I'm like, I'll know when you do. And so, yeah, I was like, okay, this is also the non-glamorous side that comes with being first gen. It's not, I have this college degree, not everything is figured out. I still have to navigate a lot of firsts for after this and continuing even now into the second phase of my professional career, where I've left that first job and now I have a job with a lot more responsibility and still navigating what that means to be a mid-level professional now as opposed to an entry-level one. So I still don't have it figured out. I'm still like, okay, if I can pay, I am happy if I can pay all my bills on time and then grocery shop. That is where I'm asking, and that is what I'm grateful for. So I think in terms of finances, I am learning just as much as I feel like a lot of people maybe who think I know a lot or want to know are learning too. So yeah, that's where I am.
But to me, it's always real to hear stories like this, because I think so many believe that when you walk out the door, you know what to do. And that's not always the case, right? And I remember, I've been advising for a long time. And I used to tell students, my goal is so that when you graduate, your option isn't going back to your parents' couch, right? Like you want to not have that mindset in place. But the reality is that like that's where a lot of students end up because they're still learning how
There's
to
steps before
navigate this space. When you think about sort of your experiences now, right? Being a really experienced employee, someone who's looking to grad school in the next few years, what's different, right? What's different than your time at Hopkins?
I think I am now exploring life with a more open mind than I did coming into Hopkins. I remember I mentioned earlier that I was the kind of person who had the 5-10-year plan. I knew what I was doing in 5 years, and 5 years after that, I also knew what I was doing. And I kind of felt some security in that, being able to say that in this amount of time, I see myself doing this. And kind of now that that's flipped on its head and I'm kind of picking up, starting back to kind of think about what do I want to do in a year? Maybe 6 months from now, because everything just feels, with the combination of everything going on with the pandemic, but also just the trajectory that I changed thinking about academics. I have no idea what I want to do, and I'm okay with that. And that is not something that I feel like Melissa in 2016 would have been able to tell you. Melissa in 2016 would tell you there's no way she doesn't know what she's doing, because that's not who she is. But kind of being able to sit in the feeling of uncertainty and kind of accept that that is part of the beauty of transitions and the beauty of moving through life in its stages is something that now I feel is a lot different. It's a lot different because I'm open to it and not kind of just rejecting it and kind of moving every obstacle, like moving heaven and earth to make sure that that doesn't happen or I mitigate all that uncertainty because it's kind of complex.
And the last question is the proverbial, if you were looking in the mirror at yourself in 2016 or a new student in a similar experience in 2021, what advice would you give them? What sort of wisdom and sage advice would you share?
Slow down, take your time, be present, be more like, take your time, but be more present. Enjoy the moment for what it is, not for what it's going to be, not for what it was, but being able to sit with yourself and be present in a space where like there's so much that's going on in front of you that you're missing the forest for the trees, kind of
Yeah.
It's kind of what I've always found myself doing, but trying to say, look at the big picture, but also be present in the moment to admire the tree for being the tree, not necessarily the forest. And I think in a really poetic, metaphorical way that's nebulous, is just like, take your time. I think it boils down to taking your time and being present without all of the fluff.